Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Boston jazz composer Darrell Katz. He is originally from Topeka, Kansas, and he's lived in the Boston area since 1975. He writes music of tremendous emotional immediacy, conveying political outrage, tender love, and joy. His latest 2018 CD is called Rats Live on No Evil Star, and he talked about this release. He's had a good long road in jazz, and he has great stories to tell. So please get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
All right, Darrell, thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz. I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm happy to.
So talk to me about this latest album, Rats Live on No Evil Star. How do you feel about this project?
Oh, I'm very happy and excited about it.
So what was the creative forces that went into this?
Well, it was particularly inspired in part by the title track I wrote decades ago. It's shocking to me how old that piece is. And it was an unusual piece for me to have written. There's a chamber music duo, marimba and violin. They were, strictly classical musicians playing chamber music. And as there was no existing music for marimba and violin groups, they did transcriptions of classical pieces and enlisted lots of composers to write for them. And they also did cross-stylistic things. So they were doing a concert with a small big band called Orange and Blue, which was led by George Schuler, Gunther Schuler's son. It was a really good band in Boston back then. So they enlisted jazz composers to write for them as well. And I was kind of intimidated. I was used to dealing with jazz musicians, but classical musicians were kind of foreign to me. So it was a challenge for that reason, and it was also a practical one, since this was not, an amplified violinist really, but one playing maybe in front of a microphone. So it was a textural hassle too. And anyway, I was really pleased with that piece. It came out great. It took me months and months to write it, and I was really pleased with it. And then it didn't get played again for like 25 years or something. My group doesn't have a violin. But then came across the right violinist and a mallet player and revived that piece, and we played it a couple of times, and this inspired me to write the sequel to it, if you will, the piece called How to Clean a Sewer, which there is a story explaining that rather unpleasant sounding title, but there was really good reason to call it that. And that piece is a 3-movement suite, which featured marimba and violin kind of in front of the jazz orchestra. And unlike the previous ones, these are people who were improvisers. And improvisation is really a part of these pieces in a number of different ways, traditional jazz improvisation and more free types, and I guess what could be called aleatoric improvisation, where there's really specific guidelines that come from a combination of the composer and the conductor. That would be me.
So let me ask you this. You grew up in Topeka, Kansas?
Uh-huh.
How did you get involved with music? What jazz were you listening to growing up?
Well, oddly enough, most of my interest growing up was in rock and rhythm and blues, and that's what I was playing for a long time when I was still in Kansas, which was until I was about 23. However, I think it's not insignificant that when I was really young, like when I was in grade school, I played the clarinet in the school bands, and I was really interested in that. And my dad took me to concerts of the Topeka Jazz Workshop, which was the local big band. And I can still remember some of the tunes they played, so it made a big impression on me. It seemed like for a long time I'd forgot it, and then I became an arranger of big bands, so I think that was a factor. I was in 9th grade, maybe. I was really devoted to music, although as the years went by, I got more and more serious about it.
What jazz musicians did you listen to in the beginning that really got you moving?
I've listened to a huge variety of jazz. When I first started listening to jazz, it was two things: swing era big bands and jazz guitar players, because I'm a guitar player, and that quickly expanded. Great revelations in my life were discovering Coltrane and Mingus and Monk and Duke Ellington, Ornette Coleman. Early on, I listened to a lot to the fusion groups that were appearing in the 70s, Weather Report and Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. And it's always been a lot of different things. I gradually, like I'd listen to piano players from Jelly Roll Morton to Cecil Taylor, and there's just, all kinds of things that both inspire and influence one.
Yeah.
There really isn't anything that I attempt to emulate or anything like that. When I first started writing for large ensembles like everybody else, I wanted to be like Thad Jones. I'm really not following any particular thing. My style of big band writing, and we really do prefer to call it a jazz orchestra, is I'm really trying to not sound like a big band most of the time. On that album, the song about Kansas, the Red Dog Blues, that's like a more big band kind of piece. But usually that's not what I'm going for.
So you make your way to Boston in 1975. Talk to me about that move. What kind of culture shock? What did you go to Boston for?
Oh, it was tremendous culture shock. I'd lived in Topeka, and then I'd lived in Lawrence. I'd been in Lawrence for 4 or 5 years. And I went to Boston to go to school. I went to Berkeley. And yeah, it was a big shock. It was a big shock being in this, what seemed to me this grim, terrible, mean, dangerous big city, because, where I'd been from, it seemed like that. It doesn't seem like that to me now. And being in music school was a big shock as well.
Absolutely. So talk to me about you've been in this for, over 3 decades as a jazz musician and as a director. Talk to me about how things started in music. Like, where did you start and how did things kind of progress?
My earliest profession, like I said, I was playing in rock bands in the Midwest. I was in one group that, played hundreds of nights over a period of a few years, and I'd played in a lot of other bands previously, but that's sort of completely detached from what I do now. Not entirely. It's kind of where I became an arranger, because in the rock bands we would, collectively arrange the songs so we could perform them.
What is it about arranging that's so attractive to you?
Well, actually, I don't arrange that much anymore. I I arrange my own music, which are generally composed for whatever ensemble it is in the first place. I really like working with music, provided it's music, other people's music, provided it's really wonderful music, and I can manage to find something to do with it that feels like I've put my identity on it without taking away from what it is. I've arranged a number of pieces by Ellington that I think I did fairly original things, and I felt good about it. I didn't feel like I was drawing a mustache on the Mona Lisa. And I've done a number of arrangements of music by Jimi Hendrix. Recently, I had a strange gig in Boston where I had a sax quartet play at a sort of large festival in which they had 25 Boston jazz groups spaced out along the Charles River. And they gave all of us, all 25 groups, the same set list of songs about or connected in some way to Boston. Some of them were pretty odd choices to deal with arranging jazz for a sax quartet, like Dirty Water by the Standells. One of my favorites from that was James Taylor's Sweet Baby James. So I've been kind of all over the map. In the JCA Orchestra, I've arranged a few Muddy Waters tunes that became extravaganzas, and in the midst of it, it was a real tribute to how Muddy Waters Band played, which I really admired. But at the same time, we went to a lot of places that Muddy Waters never would.
So what kind of mentor, you're in the position of being a mentor right now. Tell me about your mentors, what they taught you that has helped you in your role as one.
I studied with some great people, both at Berkeley and New England Conservatory. I studied with George Russell. I studied with Jimmy Giuffre, and a number of others. John Heiss, a classical composer. Charlie Banakis, who's a renowned teacher of improvisation. The thing that had the biggest impact on me is the piece that inspired the title I was telling you about on that album, which was Phil Wilson, who was a renowned trombonist, arranger, composer, and taught at Berkeley for 50 years. I had a kind of directed studies with him, and I'd bring in music, and he'd look at it and listen to it and say, yeah, that's pretty good, I like that. And then I would proceed to tell him why it wasn't good. And I did a lot of things like that. He'd say positive things, and I'd counter with negative ones. And finally, one day, he said to me, you've got a lot of music in you, but getting it out of you is like cleaning a sewer. And that was the high point of my musical education, because I guess it made me feel like, he felt like I was doing something valid, and I should be doing it. So then, like 30 years later, whatever, I've been teaching at the same school for a couple of decades, and he was retiring. At the same time, I wanted to write the marimba violin follow-through piece, so I dedicated it to Phil and called it How to Clean a Sewer.
Beautiful. So, at this point in your life, you've been at it for a long time. Are you happy with where you're at in your career?
Yes and no. I always hoped that these things would take me further in the world than they have, but, they haven't, so that's okay too. I've managed to keep doing what I want for a long time, and a lot of people don't get to do that. We put together the Jazz Composers Alliance Orchestra in 1985, and after about a year, we made it into a nonprofit corporation so we could seek funding to put on concerts and get recording grants sometimes and things like that. And we've always been hanging on by a shoestring, but, 33 years later, we're still going. And we feel like we've grown a lot, too, and the group is just better than ever, and we've always been going off in new directions. We don't sit in the same place. And we've made music that I'm really happy with and proud of. And we've got to work with some amazing people. We've had guest artists like Julius Hemphill, Sam Rivers, Oliver Lake, Maria Schneider, Dave Holland. Fred was on one of the albums. Actually, so are Julius Hemphill and Sam Rivers. A guy you might know, Mike Finnegan from the R&B blues circuit in the Midwest. Well, actually, he lives in L.A., but he was around Kansas for a long time. Mike Finnegan. Do you know him?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's on 2 of my albums. Singing. He was the Muddy Waters songs and things like that I did. I enlisted Mike to sing them, which was really a wonderful experience.
So let me ask you this. You've performed and orchestrated a lot of music over your life, but what live jazz shows have you seen that have left a big impact on you?
Oh, God, there's been so many. I go to a lot of classical music concerts and different things. Early on, when I first arrived in Boston, it was just, there was so much music one could hear in clubs. It's really not as good here now. I heard, more than I can keep track of. I heard Mingus, I heard Bill Evans, I heard Sonny Rollins, I heard the McCoy Tyner Sextet. I saw George Benson and Pat Martino, Thad Jones Mel Lewis Band. One thing that really has always stuck out in my mind, though, was hearing Sarah Vaughan. That was really powerful. Dexter Gordon, right when he came back from Europe and toured the U.S. Music's a great thing, and I've just enjoyed a lot of it. I've heard things more recently, too. I heard Ornette Coleman a couple of times. I've heard a huge variety of things in my life. The most recent thing that I really loved, though, was going to a Mavis Staples concert.
Very cool. So why do you love jazz?
Boy, that's hard to define, but I remember when I first started listening to jazz, I was a rock, blues, R&B fanatic, and I thought jazz, those musicians are really good, but it's too intellectual and it's not soulful. And then I discovered that wasn't true. It was powerful and expressive and soulful and lots of skill. And I don't know, in music I look to be taken on a journey. Jazz does that. A lot of music does, so I think of myself as more just I like music. Jazz has been the biggest single thing that really into Messiaen, Stravinsky, and 21st century composers like Louis Andriessen, and I love gospel music, and it's all over the place.
So let me ask you this. Everyone has a perception of who you are, your family, your friends, your fans, but you know who you are. Who do you think you are?
Well, that's a tough question. I'm a struggling and at the same time in some ways successful composer. I mean, my identity really is I'm a composer and a teacher, and by chance a band leader and conductor and a variety of things. It's really hard to define.
I hear you. Yeah, but I think you did. I think you defined it. I think sometimes brevity is the best way to go with it.
I mean, I see myself, I'm trying to live by the things I believe in, which not as, I'm not just talking about music. As I go through life, I try to be true to what I believe, and like all of us, it's not always easy.
I agree. Darrell, I think that's a great way to wrap everything up. Thank you for taking a minute out to talk about the latest album and your life in jazz. I appreciate it.
By the way, I did live in Kansas City for a while.
Oh, yeah?
After I moved to Boston, graduated from Berkeley, and then I moved to Kansas City in 1980, where I was for about a year and a half. I taught at the Charlie Parker Foundation.
Cool. Was that good?
Yeah. It was kind of weird because shortly after I got the job and started working there, Ronald Reagan removed the funding.
Oh,
so
wow.
I became unemployed in a short time, but I met some great people. Like Carmel Jones was on the faculty there.
Yeah.
Ahmed Aladdin.
Yeah, absolutely. Of all the people that are on the Kansas City Jazz radar that I always consistently hear about, from the old school, it's Jay McShann all the time, but Aladdin is one of those guys that I wish I would have had the chance to interview because the amount of story and lore around him was phenomenal. So
yeah, well, it should have been.
Yeah,
he was a remarkable player in person.
Yeah, there was a love story they published in the newspaper about a year after he passed, and his wife talked about how they fell in love, and it was one of those stories where you almost well up and get goosebumps. You're like, of all the things that was tremendous about this guy, that could have been the backbone to everything for him. At any rate, again, hey, thanks, and I guess you guys had a pretty good go up there during the fall for the World Series, huh?
Yeah, we did. I mean, it's the fourth one since 2004, so we're kind of spoiled here. And when I was in Kansas City, that was when Kansas City was in the World Series. So.
That's right. We played the Phillies in '80. Yeah.
Then I was there in '81 too at the beginning of it. Weren't they also there?
I think so. They may have done Milwaukee that year, but yeah, those were good times. That was when Brett was in 300, and there was a lot going on. Yeah, we've had our heyday, and then we just recently had it in 15. So sports is a big carousel. One way or another, it makes its way back around. But at any rate, Darrell, thank you again for taking some time out. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you for calling.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Topeka, Boston, New York City, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Darrell for his time, his music, and his cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit Neon Jazz at YouTube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.